obviously do not come from a liturgical background. Okay, say it with me. We all have rags. Now, if you think about it, that this metaphor of rags kind of holds an interesting place in our lives, right? On the one hand, they symbolize a lifestyle we seek to escape, from rags to riches, common phrase. On the other hand, you may have grown up with a rag or two that at some point became fairly precious to you. In fact, in some cases, if you think about it, the more raggedy something became, the more loved. It started out, beautiful, but over time became little more than a collection of rags held together by stuffing. He had a blanket, called it Blanky. We were not very creative with our list. More than once, that doll needed surgery to restore an arm or, sew on a leg or something like that. But rags like that, they have a certain value. At the time, at some point in her life, Candy was, one of those dolls where most gift from a beloved aunt. And once they took a vacation from Illinois to Canada, and on the way back at the Illinois border, they realized that they had left Candy behind. It wasn't even a question. Car got turned around north, back into Canada. They went to rescue Candy from a hotel laundry room death. Orberg writes, "The measure of my sister's love for that doll was that we would travel all the way to a distant country to save her." We didn't love Josh's Blanky quite that much. We did not go back. We called, but never found it. Barbie grew up and traded Candy for her husband Andy, and at that point there wasn't a whole lot left of Candy. You would have thought it would have got thrown away, but Barbie's mom could not bring herself to trash the ragged doll because Barbie's love had given it a value that made it feel too precious to just let go of, and so it made its way up into the attic. Years passed. Barbie had 3 kids, the last of whom was a little girl named Courtney. When Courtney became of the age where she wanted a doll, Barbie couldn't imagine her daughter loving any doll other than Pandy. So they traveled back to Illinois, went up into the attic, retrieved Pandy. They had to take her to a doll hospital. They have those. In fact, my mom sent one of my dad's dolls to the doll hospital at some point and gave it back to him as a gift. And so Pandy went to the doll hospital and her plastic face was made new and everything was sewed back on and rag stuffing was replaced and Pandy was transformed as new. Orberg writes, "When Pandy was young, Barbie loved her. She celebrated her beauty. When Pandy was old and ragged, Barbie loved her still. Now she did not simply love Pandy because Pandy was beautiful. She loved her with a love that made Pandy beautiful." So ask yourself this weekend, what kind of love are you going after? What kind of love do I seek? Am I seeking a love that proves my worth or a love to prove our worth? Well, we're going to see this weekend that Jesus' love gives us worth. The story starts in Luke chapter 7, verse 36. It says, "Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner, an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind Jesus, at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them." So here's the context. Jesus is invited to the home of a community leader. It's a Pharisee, a religious leader. If Jesus is looking for a boost in his ministry, because this is still pretty early on in his public ministry, if Jesus is looking for a boost in his ministry, man, this is it, because this is the ministry in crowd, the religious movers and shakers. But while he is in the house, the social faux pas of his career takes place. Once she was fresh and new, full of life and potential, somebody's little girl, but in the days since, the stuffing has been knocked out of her heart and her soul has become ragged. The story doesn't tell us if she was there because she already had an encounter with Jesus or if she came because she just hoped, she heard about Jesus and she just hoped that she could have an encounter with him. But we do know that at some point, as she stood by Jesus, she began to weep. There is something deep going on in her heart. What's going on in your heart? See, here's what I know after however many years of living and however many years of ministry. What I know from personal experience and ministry experience, what I know is that somehow our lives, the very essence of our lives, who we are and what we do and how we live. It's all wrapped up in love. How well we are loved and how well we love is at the very heart of who we are, right? I mean, when I know that Lynn's love for me is unconditional, that it's not going to end even if I screw up, even if I don't treat her well. When I know that she loves me no matter what, that gives me a certain courage and joy. It releases me from this anxiety of always having to prove myself. And on the other hand, when I'm wrestling with shame and I'm always wondering, am I good enough to be loved? Does God love me? What do I need to do more now in order that He would bless me and love me more? It's like the song that Russ Morgan wrote and recorded in 1944. It was covered by all sorts of stars like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole. You're nobody till somebody loves you. You're nobody till somebody loves you. And we see it over and over again, how much our self-worth, how much our identity is tied up in who loves us, in who we think loves us. Right? Some of us have been striving all of our lives to become somebody who is worth loving. Robert Lewis was meeting with a guy. This guy was in his 30s, and he's trying to finish up his dissertation at the University of Chicago. Pretty prestigious school. And they're having coffee, and the guy said, you know what, in the end, it won't even matter. And he was trying to work up the energy, the motivation to finish his dissertation. He said, in the end, it won't even matter. And Lewis said, what do you mean it won't matter? I mean, this guy had done amazingly well in school. He said, well, you know what, I'll finish it. I'll show it to my dad, and he'll say something like, couldn't you do any better? You got in the University of Chicago, why not Yale? You got some A's, why not all A's? Couldn't you do any better? See, he'd been striving his whole life to become somebody that his dad would want. Always trying to jump a little bit higher in hopes of hearing his dad say, you've done good, son. But it was never enough. Jump a bit higher. And you know what? It just seems like we are so open to the suggestion that we need to earn love, that we need to become someone before we can be loved. Because, here's why. Because we know that we all have rags. We all have rags. Luke describes this woman as one who had lived a sinful life. And the Pharisee at some point, this Pharisee will think in his head, you know, Jesus, if you knew what kind of woman this is, you wouldn't even let her touch you. This woman had rags. And yet still there is this yearning to be loved, this hunger to be someone worth loving who could be loved in spite of her rags. And she does something that no respectable Jewish woman in that culture, here I am, Jesus. See, now she uncovers her heart for Jesus. We all have rags. We all have rags. What are your rags? And bitterness is like CPR for your pain. You know, the pain starts to die down, and then your bitterness revives it. So that you sentence yourself to relive the pain over and over and over again. It's a rag. Or maybe your rag is regret. You think that your past has stolen your future and you'll never get it back. Or maybe it's lust. And ladies, that's not just the guy's rag. Or maybe it's just this sense of brokenness. And sometimes our brokenness comes at the hands of other people. Sometimes it's self-inflicted. And sometimes the brokenness that we have, I mean, we can't even tell whose fault it is. It just comes in the midst of a broken world, and we end up blaming God, but it's just brokenness. Or maybe your rag is the rag that tries to hide all other rags. It's pride. Here's what I found. I found that bitterness plus regret plus lust plus brokenness plus pride equals shame. And you take any one of those or all of them out, and it still leads to shame. Bitterness says they defines us. And pride is so often the mask that shame hides behind. Show me a proud man or woman, I'll almost always be able to show you shame. See, we're afraid that if we're known, we won't be loved. We're afraid that if we're fully known, we won't be loved. But we cannot be fully loved until we're fully known. We all have rags. But listen to me, while our rags might be part of our history, while while they might be reminders of what we have done or what's been done to us, while they might be a description of where we're at in this present moment. Listen, our rags may describe us, but they do not define us. Our rags may describe us, but they do not define us. At least they do not have to. Now, what is it then that defines us? Is it our success? Then our failure. See, when we define ourselves by those things, our failures become something that we need to hide. When we think that our rags define us, we start to hide our rags. It's called putting on a front or putting on a mask. So let me just talk for a moment, because that's part of this story. We're going to see it in a second. It's part of the story. Let me talk for a moment about our ragged masks. Now, I kind of like masks. In fact, the whole Knoll family kind of likes masks. 5 or 6 years ago, if you were downtown State College, you might have seen my son, Josh, youngest son, dressed in a full gorilla suit, just sitting on a bench. And he'd just wait for people to walk by and not notice him and walk up behind him and scare me. It was so, like, when I heard that he had done that, I said, Josh, really? I mean, Josh is the most introverted of our kids. And so I guess he just felt like the best place for an introverted person, just in a full bodysuit mask. And so he just went down and was looking for people to scare. I thought he'd get beat up by somebody, but he loved it. And then some of you heard the story, but I can't help but tell it again when it comes to masks. When Sarah and Katie were about 3 or 4 years old, I had this full fit over the head gorilla mask. And we found out that whenever I put that on, 1 minute loving daddy, and the next minute put it on screaming in terror. And it just scared the snot out of them. And of course, my parenting manual said we should help our kids deal with their fears. And so one time Lynn and I were playing hide and seek with the kids, and it was my turn to hide. Now, this doesn't change your opinion at all to hear that I did this, but it might change your opinion of Lynn. But this is what we were doing. We were playing hide and seek with the kids. It was my turn to hide. And in our bathroom in Grove City, Minnesota, there was this narrow closet that went from the floor up about 3 feet. And it was kind of narrow. You'd open it up, and there was a hole in the floor so you could throw your clothes down where the washer and dryer was and get them washed. And so it's my turn to hide. And so I went downstairs into the basement, and I put on that gorilla mask, and I climbed up on top of the washer and dryer so that I could stick my head with the gorilla mask through that hole. And now Lynn is leading the girls around. Where's Daddy? Can we find Daddy? Is he in the bathroom? I don't see him. Maybe he's in the tub. I don't see him there. Open up the closet. Maybe he's in the closet. Little girls, open up the closet. There's this girl ahead. I roar, and the look on their faces was priceless. I know, bad parent, but good sermon illustration. And do you know why it was a good sermon illustration? Because do you know why they were afraid? They were afraid because they were still young enough to believe that the outside is a good indicator of what's on the inside. And then we start to grow up and we start to realize that the outside isn't always a good indicator of what's on the inside. That we get used to putting on masks. That everybody wears these masks. Have you ever heard of the Johari matrix? You see the Johari slide. The matrix helps us think through who we are and what's known about us. And so I kind of changed the words up to make it a little bit more biblical. But the personal part of us is the part that's seen by me but not by others. That's personal. Seen by me but not by others. The public part is seen by me and by others. You see this about me, I see this about me. It's knowledge that we share about who I am. The missing part is what's seen by others but not me. Sometimes we call that a blind spot, right? We all have blind spots. And then the masterpiece is what's seen by no one. And in parentheses, I put but God, because that's the whole point of Ephesians 2:8, is that God is in the process of making us his masterpiece, shaping us to be like Jesus. In other words, he sees what none of us can see about me, about you. But see, oftentimes that personal part, the part that's seen by me and not by others, not just seen by me and not by others, it's hidden by me. So that you don't see it. So that box becomes a mask. It's the mask box, not just the personal box. It's what I hide. So this woman is going public with her rags, and the Pharisee puts on a mask. And when the mask goes on, we do this thing. I'm going to describe it in a moment. The story kind of hints at it. But when we put the mask on, we do this thing. Look at verse 39. It says, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner. See, he thought that you needed value in order to be loved. And if there was a love-value scale, it was Pharisee at the top, prostitute at the bottom. It was religious, righteous person at the top and rags at the bottom. So he put on a mask. And he did this thing that we do when we put on masks. He did this thing that we do where I'm hiding my rags and I'm highlighting yours. I'm excusing my rags and I'm exposing yours. See, it's rarely enough when we put on our mask, it's rarely enough to hide and excuse my rags. When I go into mask mode, sooner or later I find myself highlighting and exposing your rags. And you know what we call this, right? It's called hypocrisy. And the scary thing is that Jesus reserved his most stinging rebukes for hypocrites. In Matthew 23, verses 13 through 29, he lashes out at the Pharisees 8 times, and he ends with these words. In the Living Bible, it says it this way: woe to you, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look fine on the outside, but you're full of bones and decaying corpses on the inside. You look good on the outside, but inside you're full of sin and hypocrisy. John Stott once said, we have a fatal tendency to exaggerate the faults of others and minimize the gravity of our own. I know none of us do that. See, when we try to hide our rags, we end up hiding our eyes. It's like a toddler. Isn't that kind of fascinating? Like a toddler, when they think that you can't see them because they've covered up their eyes. I mean, that's really what's happening here. Remember, as this woman is crying all over Jesus, uncovering her rags in a very public way. In verse 39, Luke tells us that when the Pharisee saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner. And, conversely, that he wouldn't let her touch him. Now see, in that culture, in that day, a prophet really had 3 primary roles. When this guy said, if Jesus was a prophet, he would see that they had 3 primary roles. One role was to listen, one role was to speak, and one role was to see. So they would listen for the words of God, to be able to speak them to the people of God, but they were also seers. Sometimes they were called to see into the future. Sometimes they were called to see into the inner life of people. But always they were called to see with God's eyes. A prophet is a seer. And so the Pharisee is disappointed, or maybe actually he's secretly glad, because he thought that Jesus was a seer, but obviously not, because if he was, he'd know. And so he kind of thinks to himself, Jesus must not be a seer. And Jesus knows what he's thinking, so he tells a story. He says, you know what? 2 people owed a debt to the same guy. One person owed about $100,000 and the other owed about $10,000, and neither one could repay. So the man forgave both debts. And then Jesus said, Simon, which one will love that man more? Simon is the Pharisee. Simon, which one will love that man more? And Simon responded, I guess the one whom he forgave more. And Jesus said, that's right. Verse 44, then he turned to the woman and he said to Simon. Now, picture that. He didn't turn to Simon and say to Simon. He turned to the woman and he spoke to Simon. He turned to the woman and he spoke to Simon. And what did he say? Do you see this woman? Simon didn't think that Jesus was a prophet, but Jesus knew that Simon was not a seer. See, when we try to hide our rags, and our rags become a mask, we just don't see people. Yeah, I don't think there's very many of us who are really good at seeing people. We see issues and we see differences and we see causes. We see politics. But do we see people? Well, one of the experiences that deeply shaped me for my ministry here in Central PA happened 20 years ago. was sitting with a group of people from our community, and the gathering had nothing to do with church, but in the midst of our conversation, I had the opportunity to ask them what they thought about church and God. And to be honest, and I hope that a lot of this is just because of 20 plus years of more immaturity than I have now, but to be honest, in that moment, what I thought I knew about the people in this group was enough for me to label them kind of like Simon labeled the woman. And so, I asked the question, and one guy in the group began sharing how his struggle as a gay man had caused him to leave church because it didn't seem like he could find a place in any church to wrestle with who he was. Later, a state student, a gal, shared how she had actually grown up in church and at some point had begun to have a sense of a call as an atheist. The tears just started rolling down her cheeks as though she really missed Jesus. Can you introduce them to me? But Dan, just do you see them? Do you see the people that I love so much that I died for them? And will you see them? And you know what? People like this woman flocked to Jesus. The more ragged they felt, the more likely they were to seek him out to find meaning and hope and love. What if Jesus is actually calling us to be more prophetic significance into their lives? We need more seers. When I was it was literally the last thing in the world at that point that I even would ever want to be. But those words never let go of me. She saw something in me. And we don't even need to try to speak into somebody's people. You're a good leader. You're so helpful. You're a good servant. I see that in your heart. God loves you so much. We need that. We can't put on self-selective masks. When you put on a mask that blinds you from seeing other people, listen to me, you're going to miss Jesus too. In verses 44 through 47, Jesus said to Simon, listen, I came kissing my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she's poured perfume on my feet. So I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who's been forgiven little loves little. Now listen, is a good indicator of someone who has been forgiven much. Loving well is a good indicator of somebody who has been forgiven much. And when we wear masks to hide our rags, we don't experience the grace of Christ. And as a result, we love little. Want to grow the capacity of your heart to love? Uncover your rags and receive Christ's grace. See, we love little because we don't receive his forgiveness. Look at verses 48 through 50. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Go in peace. The Hebrew word for peace is the word shalom, which means wholeness. Go whole. Go heal. It's this sense of overflowing blessing, the fullness of blessing. Go overflowing. Oh my goodness, can you imagine how her heart felt in that moment? See, so here's the point. We all have rags. And in fact, our rags may describe us in this moment, but they do not define us. What defines us, if we have surrendered our life to Jesus like that woman did, maybe some ragged life choices, but Jesus' love is unbounded. I mean, his readiness to forgive is almost scandalous. And do you understand, with Jesus, there are no masks. What you see on the outside truly reveals who he is on the inside. And on the inside, his love is unending. Though you are uncovered in front of him, and he sees every rag, you are defined by his love. Listen to me. You are loved most by the one who knows you best. Don't let your rags keep you from his love. Don't let your mask keep you from loving others. You are loved most by the one who knows you best. Love is a key. But vulnerability is required. See, this is the key difference, I think, between the Pharisee and the woman. She's vulnerable. He's in control. She has let go of control and embraced vulnerability. You know, some of the most listened to in people's lives and the stuff that she's talking about. She's done all this social research and collected stories, and her conclusion was that the people who've really found joy are the people who've been connected with life, are the people who fully embrace vulnerability. They believe that what made them vulnerable also made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable or excruciating. The Pharisee is in control of his emotions, in control of the context, in control of the story, in control of his mask, but she gives up control. And as she moves towards Jesus, think about what she has to go through to get to him. Sometimes the people who surround Jesus do not do Jesus any favors. And for what it's worth, whether you're here, sometimes it seems so easy to see your rags and to think we can hide ours. Some of us have grown up with Jesus, we just haven't. Because at some point she had to have made the decision. I don't think I'm following. I won't let my rags or their mask keep me from seeing Jesus. And you got to know that sometimes that kind of vulnerability it feels scary and awkward and uncomfortable, and sometimes it's really risky. But in spite of all of that, she makes her way to Jesus and she uncovers her rag. Don't be like Simon. He came, but he didn't see. He was far too interested in how he was seen. That has your name on it. We all have rags. In fact, apart from God, Isaiah said that even our attempts at righteousness, our good deeds, are like filthy rags. So during worship, be a little bit vulnerable. Come up and get a rag. And then maybe in the midst of worship, just take a moment and wash his feet. It's an act of worship. To present our rags to Jesus is an act of worship. And maybe you'll take your rag with you later today, and it'll be a reminder of the grace that you have received. And maybe it'll be a reminder that you need to see people. Or maybe even God will lead you to find somebody and take your rag and just share with them your rag story. And listen to me, if somebody offers to share their rag story with you, treat that like a gift. Heaven forbid you treat it any other way. It's the one who knows us best, loves us most. His love is unending and strong and sure. You are defined by that love. Let's pray. Jesus, we all have rags. There's not a single rag that any one of us have that you are unaware of. There's not a single rag that any one of us have that you did not go to the cross for. I pray that here for a while as we worship, that we would present to you our rags. That we would have this overwhelming sense of your unending love for us. I pray that you would help us to see people, to speak your words into their lives. I know that there's sin, and we're just so tempted to lead with, but you know that's a sin when we need to lead with, but you know Jesus loves you. May we be a people whose hearts grow in our capacity to love because we realize, we understand how much we have been forgiven. The Pharisee didn't love less because he had less sin to be forgiven. He loved less because he wasn't willing to uncover his sin before you. Let us be a people who uncover ourselves before you, to receive your grace and your mercy, and to experience the unending love of Jesus. Holy Spirit, would you work in our hearts this morning. Jesus, thank you that you know us best and you love us most. It's in your name we pray. Amen.